Jonathan handed the poisoned bento box to our driver, Derek. "Finish it all, sweetheart. I love you." But Jonathan made a fatal miscalculation. Derek, accustomed to his secrets, delivered the lunch to Jonathan's mistress Morgan instead of my house. I sat in the morning silence, waiting for the call that would shatter his world. Before we uncover how I unraveled this web of lies, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. At 11:51 in the morning, my phone vibrated. A text from Derek, meant for my husband. Package delivered to the mistress safely. I stared at the screen. I did not shatter. I did not cry. I did not sink to the kitchen floor in a puddle of despair. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was a balance sheet reconciling in real time. The meticulously prepared bento box, my favourite meal, wasn't an apology for his recent coldness. It was a weapon. Jonathan had long since stopped paying attention to my daily schedule, simply assuming I was working from the office as I usually did. Because I had changed my routine to work from home today, Derek had assumed the office delivery was for Morgan. I had narrowly escaped death by a matter of minutes. I opened my laptop and began documenting my movements and his. I wasn't a victim. I was a strategic observer auditing the end of my marriage. For years, I had worn the invisible chain of the survivor, trapped in a trauma bond that kept me compliant. I had confused his breadcrumbs of affection with love, convincing myself that if I just endured his moods, the man I married would return. But trauma bonds do not break with dramatic epiphanies. They break with cold clarity. Realizing he wanted me dead snapped the chain instantly. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for the man I thought I knew, but there was only precision. I pulled up our shared calendar, downloaded the tracking data from our vehicles, and began building my ledger. Conflict initiated at 11:51. By 12:03 in the afternoon, my retaliation plan was operational. No hesitation, no breakdown. Only immediate, decisive action. The bento box was a symbol of his domestic betrayal. Beautifully packaged poison meant to erase me from the equation. He wasn't shocked by what he had done. He would only be shocked that I had stopped playing along. I looked back at the last 3 years of our union. Jonathan presented himself to the world as a titan of industry, a man whose successful business ventures commanded respect. But behind closed doors, his empire was built on a foundation of reckless debt and hollow arrogance. He suffered from the illusion of power generated by an empty wallet. He viewed me not as a partner, but as an extension of his own wealth, an asset to be liquidated or discarded when it suited his bottom line. I recounted the moments I had silently funded our lives. I paid for our groceries, the lease on our home, and even quietly settled his private debts when his creditors became too aggressive. In return, he gaslighted me into believing I was the one who was financially irresponsible. Every conversation about money ended with me footing the bill. Love had been a subscription, with me paying the premium for a service that delivered only manipulation. The clearest metric of his character was the medical bills for my son. When my boy required care, Jonathan refused to contribute a single cent. He told me, with absolute coldness, that those expenses were a bad investment. Meanwhile, he was purchasing luxury items for Morgan, classifying them as necessary expenses. I remember a Tuesday evening when he stood in our kitchen, claiming we were completely broke, effectively silencing my request for my son's medical copay. The very next afternoon, I found a receipt for a $12,000 diamond watch, shipped directly to Morgan's downtown address. This wasn't just infidelity, it was systemic embezzlement of my life and resources. He felt entirely entitled to sacrifice me because, in his mind, my sole purpose was to subsidize his grand facade. He believed his title and tailored suits granted him immunity from accountability, but I was the one keeping the lights on. I had provided the raw emotional labor, the silent financial backing, and the unwavering loyalty that allowed him to play the successful executive. My love had been a contract he breached daily. As I pulled up the medical invoices and placed them next to his credit card statements, the discrepancy was glaring. I was staring at a list of broken promises, quantifiable proof that my compassion had been weaponized against me. The anger didn't rise in a fiery crescendo. It settled into my bones like ice. I was preparing to foreclose on Jonathan. By the end of that week, Jonathan's financial house of cards began to collapse. His erratic behavior escalated from subtle manipulation to outright hostility. He cornered me in the hallway, his face twisted in a sneer, demanding I sell my remaining family assets. "This marriage is a sinking ship," he told me, his voice devoid of any warmth. "And you are the anchor." He needed cash, and he expected me to bleed myself dry to keep him afloat. He was no longer trying to hide his contempt. He treated me like an incompetent subordinate, assuming I was far too weak and simple-minded to investigate his demands. But I was already auditing his life. I noticed the paper trail he was meticulously creating. He had been forging my signature on loan applications and backdating corporate documents to make it look like I was the primary decision-maker in his failing ventures. He was trying to frame me for his own financial mismanagement, ensuring he had a pristine exit strategy while retaining his status as the innocent victim of a reckless wife. He demanded I sign fraudulent tax returns, telling me it was standard procedure and that I wouldn't understand the complex corporate structure. I signed nothing. Instead, I photographed every document he left unattended. While searching for his latest batch of forged contracts, I found a hidden burner phone tucked inside his briefcase. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask why. I just opened the device and scrolled through the messages. It was his direct line to Morgan. They were casually discussing the endgame, their plan to liquidate my assets, collect the insurance, and disappear. He wrote about me with utter disdain, confident that his plan was foolproof. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He didn't realize that his arrogance was his greatest liability. He thought he was maneuvering me into a trap, but he was simply digging his own grave while I quietly handed him the shovel. I shifted gears completely. The time for observation was over. It was time for systematic action. I hired a forensic accountant and a private investigator using a private emergency fund he didn't even know existed, assets I had shielded from his financial reach months ago to ensure my independence. I never confronted Jonathan. I played the dutiful, oblivious wife, letting him believe he was succeeding in his grand manipulation. I smiled over morning coffee. I asked mundane questions about his workday. I let him feel powerful, knowing that his inflated ego would blind him to my movements. He was so arrogant, so certain of my intellectual inferiority, that he never bothered to password protect his devices. While he slept, convinced he was a mastermind, I sat beside him in the dark, my face illuminated only by the glow of his laptop screen. I copied every file, every email, every hidden spreadsheet. I traced the offshore accounts that Morgan managed. I documented the shell companies he had set up in my name. The data transfer was a silent, clinical process. The most damning piece of evidence was the simplest to find. He had purchased the toxic substance online, using his real identity and his personal credit card. He didn't bother using a fake identity or a burner account, blinded by the hubris of a man who believed he was legally untouchable. He hadn't even tried to hide it, likely assuming that my impending death would be ruled natural causes before anyone looked closely at his bank statements. I collected the shipping manifests, the digital receipts, and the chemical composition details. I compiled it all into a meticulously organized dossier. There was no panic as I transferred the files. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I was gathering the necessary documentation to close an account that had been operating at a catastrophic loss. Every gigabyte of data was another nail in his coffin. I backed up the evidence to 3 separate secure servers and handed the physical copies to my investigator. I had weaponized his arrogance against him. He thought I was too simple to hack his life, but I didn't have to hack anything. He had left the front door wide open, and I simply walked in and took inventory. Just as I prepared to hand the entire dossier over to the authorities, the investigator uncovered a twist that shifted the entire dynamic of the board. Morgan wasn't just his compliant mistress. She was the architect of his destruction. Morgan had been systematically embezzling funds from Jonathan's already depleted accounts, funneling the remaining capital into untraceable offshore wallets. She was framing him for corporate crimes he didn't even know she was committing. The poisoned lunch, the grand plan to eliminate me, wasn't entirely Jonathan's brilliant idea. It was a suggestion Morgan had planted in his ear. I found an audio recording on the burner phone, a voice memo she had carelessly saved. She was laughing with a friend about Jonathan's pathetic attempt at murder. She knew he was clumsy. She knew the poison would eventually be traced back to his personal credit card. She had manipulated him into executing the hit, knowing he would be the one to face the gallows, while she vanished with the money. They were two sharks circling each other in a rapidly shrinking pool, each believing they were the apex predator. Jonathan thought he was using Morgan to escape his financial ruin, and Morgan was using Jonathan as the perfect scapegoat. And I was the only witness to their mutual, inevitable destruction. I listened to that recording and felt a profound sense of detachment. I had been married to a man so blinded by his own narcissism that he couldn't see the blade his lover was holding to his throat. Morgan planned to disappear with all the remaining funds by Friday. I didn't warn him. I didn't interfere. I let the predators tear each other apart. I simply updated my ledger, added the embezzlement proof to the police file, and prepared for the final transaction. The trap was set, and they had armed it themselves. I had proactively shared my documented evidence of the imminent danger with the authorities, ensuring they were on standby and ready to intervene the moment the delivery was confirmed. Jonathan was at his corporate headquarters, sitting at the head of a high-stakes board meeting, radiating the false confidence of a man who believed his biggest problem had just been permanently removed from the equation. He expected a phone call from Derek, or perhaps the authorities, informing him of his wife's tragic, sudden passing. Instead, his phone rang in the middle of the boardroom. He answered it, ready to play the devastated husband. But it wasn't a doctor, and it wasn't about me. He heard the stern, uncompromising voice of a police detective. Morgan was dead. The poisoned bento box he had handed to Derek had been delivered directly to her. Jonathan had bought the poison. He had orchestrated the delivery. He was the prime and only suspect in her murder. Derek had been granted immunity, having fully cooperated as my primary whistleblower to expose Jonathan's calculated treachery the moment he realized what he had been coerced into delivering. I wasn't there to see his descent into panic, but the investigator's subsequent report painted a vivid picture. The color draining from his face in front of his board of directors. The moment the polished executive facade shattered, replaced by the terrified realization of a cornered criminal. 3 days of forensic analysis later, once the toxicology reports confirmed the substance in Morgan's system matched his purchase records, the police arrived at his office building minutes later, walking into the glass-walled boardroom with handcuffs ready. He had been outplayed by the woman he thought was too simple to understand a tax return. I watched the news break from a safe distance, sitting in a black sedan parked blocks away. My bags were already packed. My assets were secured in newly established trusts. This meticulous transition had taken months of quiet planning, slowly disentangling my financial life from his, while he was distracted by his own arrogance. The complete dossier of his fraud, Morgan's embezzlement, and his attempted murder of me had been handed over to the district attorney an hour prior. I didn't call him to gloat. I didn't seek a dramatic final confrontation. I simply opened my contacts, selected his name, and deleted his number. The contract was officially terminated. Justice is a methodical process, and the scales have finally balanced. Jonathan is currently sitting in a state penitentiary, awaiting trial for multiple counts of corporate fraud and the first-degree murder of Morgan. His assets have been frozen, his reputation obliterated, and his future confined to a concrete cell. I am safe. My son is safe. I have relocated to a new city, secured my family assets, and built a foundation that no one can ever undermine. I look at the cracked photo frame of my old life, a perfectly staged picture from our wedding day. It symbolizes the false happiness I once tried so desperately to hold on to, the illusion of a partnership that never existed. I realize now that revenge was never the actual goal. Survival was. Survival demanded cold clarity and precise execution. To those of you listening who always feel like you are living on the edge, walking on eggshells, to appease someone who diminishes your worth, I offer this truth. Your strength does not come from their approval. Your value is not determined by how much abuse you can endure. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not require reconciliation. And peace is infinitely more valuable than performance. I stopped performing the role of the compliant victim, and in doing so, I reclaimed my life. I am no longer an anchor dragging a sinking ship. I am the architect of my own future. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their boundaries are valid. Subscribe for more stories of justice and survival, And let me know in the comments, what's the biggest boundary you've ever had to set?